Welcome to Christian Biblical Church of God's Friday night online fellowship meeting. We hold this once a week, and we get together to listen to an elder in CBCG give us a message. So tonight we're going to hear from Marlin Fannin, and he's going to bring us a message. The title is, Are You an Example for God? Marlin Fannin.
Well, happy Sabbath to everyone in all the different time zones around the world. And as Steve said, my title, Are You an Example for God? And I guess it should have said, Are we, to put myself in there, because we all are responsible for our actions and our relationship with God. So it's something we all have to do. Years ago, and probably some of you remember Aunts and Ella Mae Cates, and Ella Mae said to me one time that someone had said to her, she said, I would rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. So I think we've all been through that and how true that is. So we all have heard and seen, and people say, well, do what I say, don't do what I do. So they weren't concerned about what they did. They just wanted us to follow whatever their command was. So many don't practice what they teach or what they preach, and that's truly bad. That is a bad example. So that's why it's so important to set a good example for people, both in and out of the church. So tonight I'd like to go over some good examples and also maybe a couple of bad examples, and that we can learn from. We can learn from the good, we can learn from the bad. So I'd like to start out in Genesis with Abel. In Genesis, the 4th chapter, let's go there, Genesis 4. Genesis 4 and verse 4 starting out. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, and Cain was very wroth. In other words, he got very angry, and his countenance fell. So we see that Abel offered a right kind of offering, that he was instructed and taught, I'm sure, by God on what to sacrifice and what pleased God, what he commanded. But Cain, he thought, well, he just brings some fruit or something or vegetables from the garden, and he didn't offer a lamb like he was supposed to. So he got mad, as many people do. When we see other people doing the right thing and we get jealous, we get envious, which he did, and it ended up killing his brother. But anyways, talking about Abel and how that he was righteous, a righteous man, and he did what he was supposed to do. And certainly that he offered an offering, Abel did the right way and not as Cain. We know that Abel was a righteous man. God called him righteous. And also in 1 John, there's a scripture that talks about righteous Abel and how he did the right thing. And Hebrews were talked about and listed as one of the righteous. So a good example to start out with, and that is Abel, how he served God. He wanted to please God. He wanted to do the right thing, whereas his brother Cain was defiant and did not. So I'd like to go now for the next example. Let's go to the book of Daniel. And so in Daniel, the 1st chapter, starting out verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, unto his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, Babylon, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasures of the house of his God. And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his officers, that he should bring some of the children of Israel and of the king's seed, notice that, of the king's seed, and also of the nobles. So we don't know what lineage that Daniel was, where he was of the king Hezekiah or one of the other nobles, but he was of, we could say, royal blood. So bring young men in whom was no blemish, there's not to be any blemish, and who were handsome and skillful in all wisdom, and who had knowledge and understanding, even those who were able to stand in the king's palace, and he was able to teach them the writing and the language of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily portion of food and wine, what they were going to eat, king's food. And among them were 4 of the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we see here that their names were changed. It says, to whom the chief of the officers gave new names, for he called Daniel Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Shadrach, and Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. So they had particular names there that they had given to them, which their Hebrew names meant certain things and good names, but the Babylonian names did not. So I'd like to go ahead and go to Daniel in the New King James, in the King James rather, not New King James, but King James Study Bible, and read the footnotes here, which I thought kind of adds to the story and good to read about the names there. It says, the name changes are a good example of attempting brainwashing. In other words, taking away their identity, the good names, as we're going to see, that the Hebrew meant, into Babylonian names. It says all 4 young men had good Hebrew names that reflected their godly heritage. They were given instead Babylonian names that denoted praise of Babylonian gods, so reflected the gods of Babylon. Daniel, whose name in Hebrew meant God is my judge, was changed to Belteshazzar, which will be Baal will protect. In other words, Baal will protect you, the god of Babylon. Hananiah, which means God is gracious, was changed to Shadrach, which means inspiration of the sun. So we see the sun worshiped, they worshiped the sun god. And Mishael, which means God is without equal in Hebrew, they changed his name to Meshach, which is belonging to AQ, AKU. And Azariah, which Hebrew is the Lord is my helper, to Abednego, which means servant of Nego. It says their new names were intended to give them a Babylonian rather than a Hebrew identification, taking away their heritage from them, their names, godly names that meant something to reflect on Babylonian gods, rather than a Hebrew identification. The rest of the book shows that although the Babylonians could change the name of the young men, they could not change their character. So I thought that was interesting there as far as what the new names, their Hebrew names meant, and what their names were changed to, which I reflected upon the gods of Babylon. Verse 8 then continued on in chapter 1, but Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he asked permission of the chief of the officers that they may not defile him. So Daniel knew the dietary laws, and he did not want to eat the foods there of Babylon, which contained all kinds of probably unclean things. And so he said, test us for 10 days. Verse 12, I beg you, prove your servants 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. So they did. They tested them. And at the end, verse 17, as the 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and skill in all writing and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. But at the end of 10 days, verse 15, it says, their faces looked fairer and fatter in flesh than all the youths who had eaten the king's food. So the king then brought them in. He talked to them, and among them were found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they stood before the king. And they had all kinds of wisdom, understanding that the king, everything that the king asked him, and found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters who were in all his kingdoms. And Daniel continued to be continued then all the way to the year of King Cyrus. So I remember one of the ladies used to attend church. She worked at school where some of our grandkids attended, and they went through line, and I don't know where at that time they may have been in the ages 8 to 12. I don't remember. It's been years ago. They're grown now, but they were going to serve them something that was unclean, and the teacher, she was the member was associate teacher there, I guess, or assistant. And she was really surprised because they stood up and said, we can't eat this. And they were good enough at the school to go ahead and then fix them a tray of something that was clean that they could go ahead and eat. So she was really impressed because they weren't very old to stand up and say, no, we can't eat this. And we want something else. So that's what Daniel did. He said, test us. And they did. And they found out on the diet that he proposed that they were certainly, their complexion and everything, their health was much better than the others. So we see God was with them, and God gave them knowledge, and he gave them wisdom. Let's go to chapter 2, and we know that Nebuchadnezzar then has a dream. And I won't read all of it, just parts of it, because we're familiar with this, I'm sure. And he had a dream, and so he asked all the wise men and the soothsayers and magicians about the dream. And they said, well, you tell us the dream, and then we'll give you the interpretation. He said, no, I want you to tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me the interpretation. So they said, well, this is not possible. No man can do this. And so Daniel and them, their lives were on the line too. So he went before God and he prayed, he and his companions, and God revealed to him what the dream was. And he is able to go in and tell the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 16 in chapter 2, then Daniel went in and asked of the king, they would give him time and he would make known the meaning of the king. Then Daniel went into his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the companions, that they might pray for the mercies of God in heaven concerning the secret that Daniel and his companions should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So he began to thank God for revealing that dream to him. Verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So the dream was revealed, and he thanked God. Verse 23, I thank you and praise you, O God, my Father, of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we desired of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. In verse 25, then Arioch brought Daniel in before the king and said to him, I found a man of the captives of Judah who will make the interpretation known to the king. Then the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, had been changed, are you able to make known to me the interpretation of the dream which I have seen, and interpret the dream to me, its interpretation? And Daniel answered before the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded cannot be shown to the king by the wise men, the enchanters, the astrologers, and the magicians, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets and makes known to King Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days, your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed, which are these. Then he told him, interpret the dream. And then he was certainly blessed and thereby Nebuchadnezzar and his position. So let's go on to chapter 6. I want to give another example here of Daniel, and then we'll go to his three companions and what happened to them. Chapter 6, verse 1 through 3. So this is many years later. It said that it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, which were like governors, or in many cases, more or less like a vassal king. So he set over his whole kingdom, and over them were 3 presidents. And Daniel was one of them, so he had a very high position, so that these satraps might give account to them, and the king should not suffer loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the presidents and satraps because a surpassing spirit was in him, and the king was planning to set him over all the kingdom. So continuing on, then we see that they set Daniel up. Then the presidents and the rulers sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they couldn't find no fault or occasion in him, because he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So Daniel set a good example, an excellent example. They hear these men, and he was in a high office, could find no fault in him. Then the men said, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So Daniel served God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't serve the gods of Babylon. Then these presidents and rulers assembled to the king and said to them, King Darius, live forever. So they were beginning to butter him up. And the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects, and the satraps and officials and the governors had planned together to establish a statute and to make a strong decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, except from you, O king, he shall be thrown into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish this decree and sign the writing so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Once it was written down, it could not be revoked. Then King Darius signed the writing. And when he had learned that the document was signed, Daniel went to his house, and his windows were open in his upper room toward Jerusalem. And he kneeled on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed, and he gave thanks before his God as he did before. So that didn't change Daniel. He was going to continue to pray for his God. The windows were open where he could look toward Jerusalem, remembering how it was when he was there in the kingdom, and where before God took them into captivity because of their sins against God and rebellion and worshiping other gods. And Daniel prayed 3 times a day. So these men found that out and reported it to the king, and certainly he was displeased because he realized that he had been set up. So he was up, and he was concerned about Daniel, and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and he went down there the next morning. He asked if Daniel was all right. At verse 20, and when he came near the den, he cried with a grievous voice to Daniel. The king spoke and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God, whom you always serve. Get that? Whom you always serve, able to deliver you from the lions? And he said to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lion's mouth, and they have not hurt me, because before him innocency was found in me. In other words, I was innocent of this matter. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. So the ones that then had set the king up, trying to get Daniel killed, a horrible death by throwing him into the den of lions, that they and their family then were thrown into the den of lions, and punishment came back up on them, which they hoped to have done to Daniel. So what a good example that is to us today as we think about times we might go through in the future. That God, if we're with God, God's going to be with us. And to have the courage of Daniel, that we will realize God will take care of us. And also what an example that must have been to the captives that were taken from Judah, to understand and hear about Daniel and hear about how the king had taken care of, how God had taken care of him. Very, very encouraging to them as well. So again, as I said, we must be an example for God within and without. And so it had to be very encouraging to them. Let's go back now to chapter 3, and we'll look about the trial we're all familiar with of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who formerly were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So we know that the king, and I'll just read because we're familiar with this, most of us are. If not, you can read it at a later time. How that Nebuchadnezzar, he made this great image. And it was said that whenever they played the lyre and the harp and the bagpipes and the music, you shall fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And verse 11, and whosoever does not fall down and worship, he shall be thrown into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now there are certain Jews whom you have set over the business of the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, do not heed you. In other words, they're not listening to you. They do not serve your gods. So that's good. It says they do not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. So Nebuchadnezzar goes into a big rage, and you can imagine how his eyes probably bulged out and his face turned blue like a line of the song way back years ago. I think it was George Jones who sang the song about white lightning. You drank it and made your eyes bulge out and your face turn blue. So I'm sure the rage that Nebuchadnezzar had there said that you don't want to be a man around this man right now, around the king. So Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, and he said, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? So he gives them a second chance. Now, if you're ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the zither, the lyre, the bagpipes, and all that you fall down and worship the image which I have made. But if you do not worship immediately, you shall be thrown in the middle of a burning fiery furnace, and who is that God shall deliver you out of my hand? So what a blatant, pompous statement that he said, where is the God that's going to deliver you out of my hands? In other words, I am God. People worship me, and they worship this image I have set up. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer a word to you on this matter. In other words, we don't need to think about it. We don't need to go over in the corner here and talk about it. It says, if that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, in other words, if God decides not to, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. So Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and so they were thrown in the fiery furnace. In verse 21, then these men were tied up in their cloaks, their tunics, and their robes, and their other clothes, and were thrown in the middle of the burning fiery furnace. Then because the king commanded was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and threw them in. So we know the rest of the story where the God did spare them, and Nebuchadnezzar saw someone else in there with them. And he said, and the form is the fourth, and the form of the fourth, verse 25, is like a son of the gods. So they were restored. God protected them. And again, they were given a higher position in his kingdom. Go now to, let's go to verse 29. And a decree is given by me, well, verse 28, let's go there. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and has delivered his servant who trusted in him. They trusted in God, and that's where we must put our trust. And has said as nothing the king's words, and has given back their bodies from the flames, so that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. And the decree is given by me that every people, nation, and language who speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and his house shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God who can deliver in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So they saw what an example and faith that the king saw. So they saw a living sermon there. They saw action, the people believing in their God and following their God, not the gods of Babylon. So I heard one time this minister speaking, and I don't think it was one of the churches of God, and he was going over this book of Daniel, and he's talking about them not bowing down and worshiping them, and he kiddingly said, I think it was probably me, when he said, okay, you got to bow down and worship this image. He said, I would probably have said, boys, I think this is a good time for us to bend over and tie our shoes, and laugh. So I thought that was kind of humorous, but that might be true of most of us. We might wish, well, we'll go bend over, not really bound to it, but we'll tie our shoes. So, but anyway, they were filled with the faith and trust and belief in God and his knowledge that he was going to deliver them. I'd like to go now to an example that is in the book of Ruth about Naomi. So let's go to page 8. We'll go back a few pages to 826. And we've heard a lot about, and we had an excellent message just recently by Michael Heiss on the book of Ruth. And many have given messages on that. I know I have myself and done Bible studies on it. But I don't think we take into account, Naomi as an example. And what a good example she must have been. So I'd like to go over some scriptures here. So we know the story that her husband had died and her 2 sons had died. And she heard that things were going well back in Bethlehem area, I think it was, and how God had blessed them with rain and everything, and the crops were good, and she was going back. And starting out in verse 11, and Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband, and also tonight, and also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you shut yourselves up and not have husbands until them? In other words, until they grew up, would you wait? She said, No, my daughters, for it makes me very sad for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her and said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return back with your sister-in-law, because they worship the gods of Moab. But evidently that Naomi had showed them the true God, the God of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and worshiped him, and had set a great example, evidently. Because verse 16, Ruth said, "Do not beg me to leave you to return from following after you, for where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." So Naomi had set a good example, evidently, for her to be able to say this, and both her daughter-in-laws to want to go with her. And so Ruth said, "No, I'm going to cling to you. I'm not going back. Your people is going to be my people, and your God, my God." Verse 18, and when she saw that she was determined to go with her, then she quit speaking to her. So what a bond that Naomi must have set with her daughter-in-laws, to set such good examples that they wanted to go with her. So she must have been very kind and very loving. Let's go back to verse 9, read it. It says, "The maid of the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. As I said, she must have been very compassionate and loving toward them, because she kissed them, and they started weeping. In verse 14, it said, "And they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." In other words, she held on to her. She wasn't going to go. Such an example that Naomi had set. "No, I'm going with you. I'm not going back to that life that I had in Moab. I want to be with your people, and I want to serve your God. That your people will be my people, and your God will be my God," because Moab worshiped false gods. So Naomi must have, by her faith and character, shown the true God, the God of Israel. So they saw a living sermon, not something that was preached, but a way of life, action, serving God, living God's way of life, being an example, loving them, showing kindness and patience. So those things I don't think we've ever brought out. Probably has been, maybe somebody did, but I thought that would be good to bring them out. We're very familiar with Ruth and what goes on there, and how she's married and becomes in the lineage of Jesus Christ. But what a great example that Naomi must have set there. I'd like to go to Phineas now. Let's go to Numbers 25. Numbers 25. And this is a situation where that says, Israel dwelled in an acacia grove, chapter 25, verse 1. And the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. As I just said, they worshiped false gods. And they called the people to the sacrifices of their gods. And the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself to Baal Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the heads of the people and impale them before the Lord facing the sun, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel." And Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Every one of you kill his men who are joined to Baal Peor." Then I behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought to his brethren a woman of Midian in the sight of Moses, the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So he blatantly went ahead and just in sight of all the people took this woman into the tent there. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, so he had been the grandson of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a spear in his hand. And he went in after the man of Israel into the tent, and he pierced both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly, So the plague was stopped. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. You can imagine that, 24,000 people killed right there that day, evidently. So Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, in that he was zealous for my sake among them, so that I did not destroy the children of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I have given my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. So what an example that he set there and turned God's anger away, that the rest of the people were spared. And God tells him that he made an everlasting covenant with him and his seed in the priesthood. So somewhere we know that his descendants are still alive upon this earth, because God promised that. Let's go to Genesis 39. Genesis 39. And we'll read about Joseph and what a good example that he set. Genesis 39, and we'll start out in verse 6. So we know that he ran from sin. And he said, how can I sin against God? So chapter 39 and verse 6. So he was taken to Egypt. We know he was sold as a slave, the Midianites, I think it was, and he was sold there, and he became a servant of Potiphar, official of Pharaoh, the chief of the executioners, an Egyptian man. So it's going down. So this man, he left everything in Joseph's hand. He did not concern himself with anything that he had except the bread which he ate. And Joseph was handsome in form and good looking in appearance. So he trusted Joseph. He set such a good example, and he was dedicated to him and loyal to him. So he sent him over all of his affairs. And so I'm sure that Joseph had to go into the house there to take care of business, paperwork, different things as we call it today. And it said he was handsome, and he also was good looking in appearance, probably well made, and a young man. And after these things, it came to pass that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, my master does not know what is in the house with me, and he has given all that he has into my hand. There is none greater in this house than I. Neither has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. And then how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph had been taught by his father, Jacob, and he understood this was wickedness. This was sin, and that sin is against God, breaking his commandments. So he knew, as it said, Abraham kept God's laws and his commandments and judgments, and that God said of him, I know you will teach your descendants after you as well. So Jacob must have taught Joseph, and he said, this is sin, this is wickedness, I can't do this. But day after day, she kept on till finally that he came in one day and she grabbed his coat, and he turned and took off. So she kept his robe there, her coat. And so she was mad and upset that she couldn't persuade him. And how many other people had she persuaded to do this? Joseph may not have been the first one. So anyway, we know the story, how that she lied about it, and he was put in prison. So because of false lies, and how many lies are told against God's people? What have they had to endure down through the ages, all the different things, and the lies of Satan that cause us to have things come upon us that we didn't really deserve to have brought upon us. 1 Corinthians, let's go there. we see here we're told by Paul, 1 Corinthians in verse 6, 1 Corinthians verse 6. I'm sorry, chapter 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we'll be looking at verse 18. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Paul tells us, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man may commit is outside the body, but the one who commits sexual immorality, and that's any type of sexual immorality, is sinning against his own body. What? Verse 19, don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, which you have within you from God, and you're not your own? For you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. So we're told to flee sin of any type and not let it cause us to do something that is against God and certainly against his laws and commandments. So we've looked at some good examples. I want to look at a bad example here. And let's go to Eli's son in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, the third chapter. And we're all familiar with this too, but shows what a bad example that anyone in the priesthood or ministry, or you don't have to be in the priesthood or ministry, because we all preach by our examples to our family and friends, to neighbors and co-workers. We preach by example because they think, well, you believe this way, you don't keep certain holidays and these things, and you keep the Sabbath, so they're going to be looking at us. So if something happens, they're going to be judging us. And so that's why I say preach by example, not do as I tell you to do, but you follow my example. So Eli's son, and this is chapter 3, and we'll start out in verse 11. And the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of everyone who hears it shall tingle. In that day I will confirm to Eli all that which I have spoken concerning his house. For when I begin, I will also make an end of it. He's telling him. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile and did not restrain them. So we see that he knew what his sons were doing, and he didn't restrain them. So let's go to chapter 2, and we'll see what they were doing. Chapter 2 and verse 12. And the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was, if any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servants came with the flesh, while the flesh was boiling, with a flesh hook of 3 prongs in his hand, and he struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and that the flesh hook brought up the priest that took for himself. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites that came there. Yea, there before they burned the fat, the priest's servants came and said to the man who sacrificed, give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have boiled flesh from you, but raw. And if any man said to him, let them not fail to burn the fat at once, and then take as your soul desires, then he would answer him, no, but you shall give me now, and if not, I will take it by force. In other words, if you don't give it to me, I'm going to take it from you. And the sin of the young man was very great before the Lord, for men despise the offering of the Lord. So we see what bad examples do. They begin to despise the offering, that they had come to sacrifice with a willing heart to God. And here were Eli's sons doing all this corruptness, demanding all these things. So people didn't even want to come and sacrifice. And you could see how their attitude would be. And Samuel served before the Lord a child girded with a linen cloth. Let's go to verse 22. And Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with women. Not only were they polluting the sacrifices, not doing as God instructed, but they also were women gathered around there as well, and they were evidently having sexual relationships with the women who gathered at the door of the tabernacle or the congregation. And he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all the people. No, my sons, for it's not a good report that I hear you make the Lord's people to transgress. So when God's people see that those in charge that's supposed to represent God certainly are not worshiping God, then that causes the people to transgress as well. It turns them off and turns them against God, because they thought, well, how could all this, what's God doing? And he allows all this wickedness to go on. But we know the rest of the story, that Eli's sons were killed, and that Eli himself said he fell over backwards when he heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken, and broke his neck. I guess he was a very heavy man, and he fell backwards and broke his neck. So God did intervene. So bad examples certainly deter us if we let it. And that's the key, if we let it. We've seen all kinds of things down through the ages in God's word about what people did. We've seen things in our church history of things that's gone on that certainly weren't right. But the key is to still keep that relationship with God, to realize God is in charge. And you're going to have people like this, because Satan is going to spread those tares. He's going to have wolves in sheep's clothing, all of these things to try to discourage us and turn away from worshiping God. And the last example that I'd like to give, and it's going to be a two-part message, because I'm just going through the Old Testament this evening on examples there, and the next message I give, I will give it in examples and things in the New Testament. But look, we all know the story of David, but let's go to 2 Samuel. We're in 1 Samuel now. Let's go to 2 Samuel, and we'll read and go over some scriptures about what David did to Uriah, one of his top generals, you might say today, one of the main leaders. So let's go to 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 through 4. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and when he came to him, and he said to him, there were two men in one city, one rich and one poor. The rich one had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor one had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food, and he drank from his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was to him like a daughter. And there came a traveler to the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd to dress for the traveler that had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and dressed it, for the man had come to him. So he had the example there, the story, and what wisdom that Nathan used in going to confront David with this, in knowledge and wisdom as how to go about it. Because you can imagine, how am I going to address the king? But God gave him the wisdom and the knowledge in this parable, so to speak, that he talked about. So he said, this man had only one little lamb, and he took it, and he had all these others. And David's anger was greatly kindled against this man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. So we won't turn there, but in Exodus 22:1, it tells if you steal a man's oxen, you got to replace it with 5. And if you steal a sheep, then you got to replace it with four sheep. So David was going by this example here. Then Nathan drops the bombshell on David. And Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives unto your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that was too little, I would have given to you such and such things besides. Why?" The question here, why have you despised the word of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have stricken Uriah the Hittite, and said he was one of his top leaders in general, a mighty man. And you have struck him with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the children of Ammon. And we know he delivered his own death warrant back to Joab, who David told, you set him up next to the wall where that he would be killed. And now for the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Therefore thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with them, your wives, in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and for the sun. And that did happen. Absalom, his son, did this. So we see then what sin does. Here David had all these wives. And evidently it was a time in Israel where there's kind of peaceful, and David wasn't out to war with the rest of them. And I'm sure that Uriah's wife has been brought out many times, that she knew David came out at certain times of the day, in the afternoon or evening, and she was bathing up on the roof where he could see her. But he gave in to that temptation. So all of us, we need to set an example of God's way. We either set it by our ways, our talk, our actions. We either set a good way or a bad way that represents God, reflects upon him. So don't give an occasion for Satan to tempt us and allowing us to sin against God, as David fell for it. And for the rest of his life, turmoil in his house. It didn't stop. His sons, Absalom was eventually killed, who kicked David off his throne. David had to flee. And Absalom killed his oldest son, who had raped his daughter, his sister, his half-sister. And then later on, when Solomon took office, another one of his sons was killed because he wanted to be king. So the rest of his life, his household was miserable because of his giving in to sin with Bathsheba. But David repented. He's still going to be king over Israel as a spirit being, King David over Israel, when God comes back in his kingdom. It's plainly told us. I think Isaiah and Jeremiah tells us that. But David repented, and Psalm 51 is about that repentance, where he said, wash me, clean me up, give me a right heart. And that's what we need to do. When we fall short and we sin, and we all sin, as it says, that we all transgress, we all sin, we need to repent, and repent big, as David did. Matthew 5, let's go there. Matthew 5 in conclusion. Matthew 5 and verse 15. Neither do they light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it shines for all who are in the house. In the same way also, you are to let your light shine before men, so they may see your good works and may glorify, instead of bringing shame upon the name of God and God the Father and Jesus Christ, that you might glorify your God who is in heaven. So those are a lot of examples in the Old Testament, and hopefully that was helpful to me to go over those, and hopefully helpful to you. As I said, this is part 1, and the next time I'll give part 2 in the New Testament. So happy Sabbath to all of you, and we'll see you the next time.